Thank you very much. I want to say thanks to the organizers of the conference for the opportunity to be here this afternoon to speak with you. I also want to say thanks to the folks who have been cooking for us all week. But the fact is that pasta and wine over lunch makes this particular time slot almost impossible. And the best thing I can say is that I'm up here with a microphone, so I have to stay awake. And I understand that you have to do what you have to do. So I also want to dedicate this presentation to our young colleagues from the Young Leadership Conference. These folks have been hard at work in their own conference last week, and they've stayed with us this week. And I'm afraid I have to say that for all the work that we plan to put into the Promised Land and Hope project in the next 5 years, my guess is that Brad and Marty and Rebecca, we will bequeath to you this issue. And so I dedicate to you and your efforts and your growing effectiveness this presentation with all the hopefulness that you will be able to say something very different 20 years from now than I can say today. I would also encourage all of you, if these topics have any significance for you, and if you hope to see a resolution to them even in the next generation's lifetime, by all means, join the friends and sponsors of the Martin Buber House, because that's where the Young Leadership Conference gains its support. And if we want them to be able to carry this work forward, they need our support now. So I encourage you to make that commitment. Recently, I had 2 conversations that will serve well to introduce the challenges that we face when we approach the issues that swirl around the Jewish and the Palestinian peoples and the land, which both peoples see as home, and which Judaism, Islam, and Christianity all regard as holy. One conversation took place with a colleague who has worked with us in the New Paths program of the Shalom Hartman Institute, which Debbie mentioned. That program is designed to build a new foundation on which North American Christians, at least, can engage Israel. We released the first study course 3 weeks ago, and this conversation took place the next day. We were trying to identify the most effective way to convey quickly to an audience that the approach we're taking is really quite new. My colleague made a suggestion that was meant to do just that, to pull people away from the immediate conflict model and suggest another. So she said, ask the audience, just for a moment, to imagine that the UN partition plan had been accepted in 1947, that there had been no war, that 2 independent, economically interlinked states had developed side by side as Jewish and Palestinian homeland, that there was no 1967 war and no occupation. She never got to finish her sentence. We gaped at her. Are you kidding? Ask American Christians to imagine that? The other conversation took place similarly in regards to the New Paths program with 2 colleagues who are planning to teach it. We were discussing how to advertise the program and attract participants, and they suggested advertising that it's only for people who have never been to the Holy Land and have no fixed convictions about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. After all, they said, when a conversation, a discussion involves people who have traveled there and people who have not traveled there, it's always the eyewitness account that gets played as the trump card in the game. Well, if you would ever go there and see the situation, then you would understand exactly what I'm talking about and know that I am right. Have you noticed it doesn't even matter whose cause the speaker is defending or promoting? That line works equally well on any side of the conflict. And it works to stop it cold. In the first conversation, imagine there were no conflict. My colleague recognized there's no realistic perspective from which one can start the conversation about the promised land and its current inhabitants without getting trapped in a box labeled as a partisan in one camp or another and either embraced or dismissed on that label alone. Of course, we also knew immediately that her suggestion begged the question, since imagining there is no conflict will always work to the advantage of only one party in the conflict. In the second conversation, the challenge is more clearly addressed when thinking about whom to invite into the discussion. How do people with radically different perspectives and experience in dealing with a situation find the ground on which they can engage one another? But the suggestion there, to advertise it only to those with limited experience and no opinions, also begs the question, as it would simply send the two groups to their separate rooms. Thus the question remains, and the challenge, which we all know too well from our own experience. My two conversations could be multiplied dozens of times over in this room, as so many of us have found ourselves stymied in a conversation by a radical disjunction of experience, religious commitments, ethical imperatives, even facts. Recently, the ICCJ Executive Board, under Debbie Weissman's brilliant leadership, responded to this challenge with its statement, "As long as you believe in a living God, you must have hope." Previously, the board has addressed the tendency toward acrimony and polarization with its 2010 statement, "Let us have mercy upon words." Both statements affirm the importance of dialogue as a path to clearer communication and understanding. In the context of Israel and Palestine, both affirm the importance of dialogue. The more recent one helpfully reminds us that dialogue is not about conversion. Now, in the context of talking about Israel and Palestine, conversion can mean converting the other to a policy position or a moral posture, usually more so than it means religious conversion, but the implicit aggression of the conversionary approach is just as present and is felt just as strongly. By contrast, dialogue always involves, and I quote the most recent statement, an openness to changing our own hearts because of what we have learned from the hearts of our conversation partners. It's in the interest of empowering dialogue and this kind of learning in this highly conflicted setting that the ICCJ Research Council has taken up its project of promise, land, and hope. That three-part title is more than just a rhetorical flourish, and it's certainly not a poorly disguised Trinitarian reference. Rather, it lifts up the three key elements that seem to stand at the heart of the conflict between the Jewish and the Palestinian peoples over the land they both call home. For Jews and Christians, it is a promised land, or at least has been understood as such and is represented as such in Scripture. What one makes of that is a key issue. It focuses on land, because both the Jewish and the Palestinian people have national aspirations that require a physical space in which to be realized. The key issue arises from the fact that both of them know essentially the same land as their homeland. Finally, we deal with hope because it's both integral to the aspirations of the two peoples, Jews and Palestinians, and also a strong factor in the theologies of many Christians who care deeply about Israel. When you receive the published papers, I elaborate on the Christian dimensions of hope a little bit more here. But no less than in Christianity do hopes of various shapes figure in the engagements of Jews around the world and of Muslims who are not Palestinian but who see the outcome of this conflict as crucial to their worldview. Promise, land, and hope. All three are keys in the posture we adopt and the arguments we make. And understanding how they figure in our encounters with one another will help us to gain the insights of dialogue that will deepen our mutual engagement and strengthen our common quest for an end to the conflict. That introduces you to the broadest strokes of the project that's underway, and I'll say more about its particulars before I finish, assuming I have time. But first, I want to do two other things. I want to discuss some of the approaches to the issues as we encounter them in an American context in the United States. And I want to consider how the fairly distinctive American relationship of church and state influences the conversation. So first, to some American theologies. You've just been through a brilliant summarization of a variety of Israeli Zionist positions, perspectives, etc. I invite you now to take that entire structure of Zionist thought and file it for the moment in a readily available portfolio, and open a new portfolio to think about different ways that American Christians think about Israel. Okay? A new portfolio. It would be presumptuous of me and perhaps of anyone to attempt to present comprehensively the picture of American religious groups on any issue, and especially, I think, this one. So I don't pretend to achieve that standard. I hope I do represent fairly some of the main lines along which American religious groups array themselves in regard to Israel and the competing nationalisms of the Jewish and Palestinian peoples. I intend to draw a profile of different kinds of issues. People will always differ in their pragmatic, essential assessment of any particular circumstance or religious issue. Always. And where the grounds of the dispute are shared, the dialogue, the debate can move forward. But in the case of Israel, in my American context, it's the very grounds that are in dispute. And that's what we therefore will find helpful to explore. So I begin with the mainline Protestant churches. We liberal Protestants, and I count myself among them. We have traditionally represented the backbone of American society, and we are now famously in decline. Our numbers shrink year by year, and our influence on public debate has been sharply curtailed in recent years. And yet we are not absent from the public square on the matter of Israel. But our voice is divided. On the one hand, no, from your perspective, on the one hand, the left. No, actually it's not. On the one hand, many of these churches are still working out the kind of Christian realism that Reinhold Niebuhr imbued in several generations of prominent American clergy. Reading the Bible critically, they derive from its human record of divine action a sense of purpose and a template for human life and society. Those things then guide their engagement in all manner of social issues. The dignity of the individual, a broad and inclusive sense of justice, and a disposition toward nonviolence except in defense of the innocent are key elements in that template. In practical terms, it has engendered a generally positive attitude toward Israel, coupled with a desire to bring the conflict to a conclusion in a way that is mutually respectful of both Jews and Palestinians. On the other hand, among mainline Protestants, for the past 3 or 4 decades, they have come increasingly under the sway of liberation theology. First in the founding voices of Roman Catholics in Latin America, subsequently in the voices of women, blacks, Latinos, gays, and various third world communities, including the Palestinians of Sabeel, the Center for Palestinian Liberation Theology founded by Naim Atik, and the DR Consortium of Lutheran pastor Mitri Rahib in Bethlehem. The United States national church staff leaders in global mission and in public policy advocacy most often come from this background. So the public voice of the churches and the management of direct church ministries in Israel and Palestine are strongly shaped by liberationist perspectives. This stance reads the founding of Israel as a colonialist enterprise of the Western powers and advocates primarily for justice for the displaced and oppressed indigenous Palestinian people. That division within the mainline denominations is drawn still deeper because of the different experiences of the church in relation to Arabs and Jews. Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and Lutherans especially carry a heritage of educational, healthcare, and development work in the Arab Middle East since the 19th century. At the same time, these Protestant denominations have been at the forefront of dialogue programs with the Jewish community in America for generations. Often, the church leaders in these respective arenas, the dialogical and the missionary, have minimal contact with each other and only a vague awareness of what the others are doing. And so it's been easy for the churches to send contradictory messages about the church's commitments. So far, the mainline Protestants. Among evangelical Protestants, a third foundation for engaging Israel is at work. This is a theological worldview that sets biblical categories and realities at the core. Theologian Gerald McDermott is my spokesperson for the evangelicals, and he rightly argues that evangelicals are not the biblical literalists that fundamentalists are. But he also demonstrates that the promised land and the Jewish people remain theologically significant for evangelicals because they figure centrally in the Bible's salvation history. Evangelicals, he says, and I quote, take seriously God's promises in Genesis to give a land to Abraham's descendants, They cite Isaiah's vision for the renewal of Zion, especially in Isaiah 4, and for the perpetuation of a remnant. They believe that the promise of a kingdom for the new David in Isaiah 9 suggests a restored land. And note both Jeremiah's promise that the Jews would return to the land in chapter 32 and receive a new covenant, chapter 33, and Ezekiel's recurring theme of the ingathering of all the scattered Israelites in the land. Furthermore, McDermott goes on, evangelical scholars are impressed by the importance of the land in Torah. He cites Elmer Martins when he notes that the land is the fourth most frequent noun or substantive in the Tanakh. It is more dominant statistically than the idea of covenant. He goes on to say that the same attentiveness to Scripture leads many evangelicals also to apply to modern Israel the standards of justice and compassion that attach to biblical Israel's tenure in the land. So both in affirming the gift of land and in calling Israel to account for the morality of its life in the land, it's a straightforward, if not quite literal, reading of the biblical witness that informs and motivates the evangelical community. That's our third ground. The Roman Catholic community in America. We can't consider them entirely apart from their larger global context, of course, but ICCJ's Vice President, Phil Cunningham, has recently offered a state of the question analysis of Catholic land theology. In his analysis, the Catholic Church is poised between two implications of Nostra Aetate. We are all familiar with the powerful affirmations of Nostra Aetate that the Jewish people remains beloved of God and is not to be presented as repudiated or cursed by God. In the history of Christian teaching, that presentation included the image of the wandering Jew, banished by God from the homeland and precluded from returning to it, so the church has removed the onus of Jewish exile from its theological vocabulary. Yet, the same chapter of Nostra Aetate, as it deplores the hatred, persecutions, and displays of anti-Semitism directed against Jews, is careful to say that the church is motivated by no political considerations. This implies that the cause of the Jews in founding this modern state of Israel stands apart from the church's theological considerations. Cunningham notes that this is then elaborated and deepened in later writings and points to an unresolved methodological tension of respecting the religious centrality of the land of Israel for Jews as they understand it, while considering the modern state of Israel only in terms of distinct non-religious international legal norms. He also points out that Vatican documents close the paths both to a simple literal assertion of Jewish land claims and to a supersessionist posture that abrogates God's promise of the land. The task that awaits Catholics, he says, is how to articulate positively the centrist hermeneutic. In the American Jewish community, a divide has developed largely along generational lines. For those who recall the 1967 and 73 wars and the existential threats that they posed to Israel, the bond between Israel and the diaspora is unquestionable. Whether as a threatened homeland or as the haven for Jews who still face threats elsewhere in the world, Israel is a focal point of support and defense in the face of crisis. For a younger generation that has only known Israel in Lebanon and facing down two intifadas, building settlements and isolating Gaza, and managing an occupation that has stretched on for nearly half a century, the relationship is much more complicated. This is the generation that has invented J Street, the pro-Israel, pro-peace lobby that wants a more flexible embrace of Israel than the American Israel Political Action Committee, or AIPAC, is able to offer. This is the generation who, in all their philanthropy and commitments, want to be aware of and involved with the operating systems that deliver the help that they provide. This is the generation to which the Hartman Institute's I Engage project is directed, striving to lay a new foundation within the Jewish community for Israel-diaspora relations that emphasizes not unending crisis, but shared values. Not merely supporting Israel, but engaging Israel. I didn't see the number. Was it 5 or 10? 5. It's 5. Thank you. As in the Roman Catholic Church, though, the task of articulating the positive hermeneutics of that new foundation is a work in progress. Finally, I offer as a spokesperson for another American religious group, an even younger contributor, the 15-year-old Akash Mehta, whose essay on the ethics of interfaith was recently republished on the Huffington Post online. Mehta, I would suggest, represents a wide swath of American religious thought, particularly evident among the young people that I teach. He summed up religion quite succinctly, and I quote, "A religion is a system of ethics, reinforced and justified by a set of beliefs." Close quote. Period. Much to his credit, young Mr. Mehta acknowledged the ethical quest has yielded many paths, and even those who profess no religion often have an ethical system that guides them. But what's of note here is the priority of ethics over myth, ritual, doctrine, and everything else. A religion is a system of ethics reinforced by a set of beliefs. In regard to Israel, one must surmise that according to this view, any religious claim has to be deconstructed into an ethical claim and then evaluated. Often in working with my students, as well as in the broader sweep of American society, religious or not, this is the approach that I hear. With these several brief profiles, I would sketch a range of views that can be found quite easily in American society, and there are plenty of overlaps among the groups with these different approaches. But what have we heard? Scriptural hermeneutics, readings of history, political assessments, the avoidance of politics, doctrinal guidance, and ethical deconstruction, loyalty and critique, and identification, and prophetic urgency, and solidarity, and more give texture to our encounters. But just as often, they also are obscured by the white-hot emotions that attach to this issue. So where can we begin? In America, that question of where we begin is also complicated by our distinctive embodiment of the church and state issue, of laïcité, if you will. We've encountered the differences in many of our discussions and workshops. In America, we have no state religion. Religious doctrine plays no formal role in American political discourse, but religion does come into play in our political process. All the groups from the churches and the Jewish community that I can name, Churches for Middle East Peace, J Street, AIPAC, Evangelicals for Middle East Understanding, Christians for Fair Witness on the Middle East, all of the denominational advocacy offices and of the Roman Catholic Church seek to exert their influence in the religiously neutral public square. Each one seeks out allies to build coalitions to advance its religiously framed value. There's no religion in our government, but we're still a strongly religious society. So the doctrinal and biblical and theological and pastoral dimensions of Israel and the Palestinians are very much implicated when we come to the public policy process. Got it. Very briefly then, the Promise, Land, and Hope project is a collaborative endeavor of the ICCJ Research Council with 3 American and 2 European academic centers. We've had 2 meetings, and we don't want simply to assess the approaches of different religious thinkers and groups to this question. And we certainly don't hope to synthesize a single approach that might serve everyone. Rather, the question is, in the interests of dialogue and affirming diversity, what understandings, what approaches might we develop that could serve as resources for constructive dialogue about Israeli-Palestinian issues? The concept map that appears on your handout sets this guiding question at the center of the project, with 4 interrelated fields of inquiry to be explored over the life of the project, and you can see what those are. We don't know yet what the form of the tools will be as this 5-year project develops. Our next step will be a 3-day meeting in Chicago in August, where we will focus primarily on the land traditions of several communities, particularly in relation to biblical texts. The project's last paragraph. The project's goal is to provide tools that will empower dialogue and exchange, with the expectation that greater clarity and understanding will enable people to move forward toward the broad common goal of supporting the Jewish and Palestinian peoples in achieving their respective aspirations, including justice and peace. Our desire is to make it possible for many more people to engage in the kinds of dialogue and encounter that have proven so fruitful among us in Jewish-Christian relations over a whole range of difficult topics that at one time, frankly, seemed impossible. As we have in the past found the strength and the trust and the tools to address the person of Jesus, the charge of deicide, l'enseignement de mépris, the teaching of contempt, the legacy of oppression, and more. We believe we can also find what we need to be able to address together our deepest hopes and fears that attach to the promised land. Thank you.